This is on an older building across from the Medici Palace, one of them. And you notice the motif is a bat. Not sure what this is, some kind of goblin perhaps. And then up here, notice chickens, for some reason, supporting this heavy grate. More goblins. More goblins. And then probably the family crest. I'm just entering the Duomo Art Museum and confronted with Roman original art fragments from Rome, probably, of art pre-500, which is most appropriate because, in fact, the Renaissance, rather than a rebirth from nothing, is a rebirth of Roman and its precursor Greek art. As near as history can apparently define, after Brunelleschi lost the competition for the baptistry doors to Ghiberti, he and Donatello, a young teenage Donatello at the time, left for Rome. The purpose supposedly to be looking at the fragments, which were then weed-covered Roman ruins of this Roman culture. Well, Ghiberti did not apparently visit Rome in the same manner. You wonder if he did not gain a certain amount of inspiration for relief sculpture, which are his doors, from these Roman artifacts. It was not unusual for the wealthy of Florence, and Florence was by then, by the end of the 14th century, 1300s, a very wealthy city because of not only local trade, but what would be called global trade, at least as to this area. The wealthy had accumulated as decoration, if you will, for their expensive estates and palaces, chunks of Roman art. So perhaps it would not have been unusual for Ghiberti and the Brunelleschi, Donatello, Masaccio to have seen much of this in their early years. Here an interesting panel, not only beautifully sculpted in precise geometric circles, but then inlaid with some kind of stone. This site is also holy ground for those who revere Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, Donatello. All of them worked in this site, on this site, which, interestingly enough, was the site of a pagan church. More examples of the inlaying of some stone on what probably were frieze panels. Just imagine the work involved in panel after panel of identical, complex, detailed panels like these. Here, a little bit of an innovation, some kind of little doorway. And notice that it's in between a couple of arches. Not arches, but pilasters. Again, presuming this is Roman, it alludes to the same kind of columns on the faces of the Duomo itself. Notice how those little curly cues are hollowed out or sculpted out. This is Madonna with the glass eye, and Saint Zenobius to the right of her. Now these statues would have been placed on the cathedral above the main door between the period of 1296 and 1587. Notice his upright hand consecrating this ground as holy ground for the church. It's interesting, she has glass eyes. And apparently all of what we're looking at here was installed on the first facade of the church, which ultimately was ripped down because apparently it was never liked and never completed, in part due to the 1348 plague and other similar events. This sarcophagus is well worn, but you can vaguely make out some figures, a human figure there in the upper left and to the right. Whether these are angels, devils, or whatever, who knows. Looks like there's a horse there, or more in the center panel. So maybe this depicts a battle. Don't really know. Look at the facial expressions of this lion. Almost either frightened bewilderment, or this piece of work, whatever it's for, is interesting because it still retains some of the coloration. It's hard for us to think of statues like these and art or sculpture like this painted, but most of it was, both in Renaissance times as well as Roman Greek times. This is Pope Boniface III, or the 8th rather, despised by Dante for his meddling in politics, which was certainly the role of popes for much of their history. They sparred one power against the other with the emperor or with the kings of England later on. His hat, made particularly large just for him, he paid apparently 3,000 florins to be installed on the face of the church. He would symbolize perhaps the kind of church that Martin Luther King would love to hate. John the Baptist, done by Donatello when he was 22. And just shortly before he did the famous statue that he did for the Saint Michel niche. It's pointed out by the guidebook that here John has a massive right hand, relaxed, resting on his knee, that, like the large hand of Michelangelo's David, would precursor sculpture by 100 years. I don't know why that's true, but impressive for a 22-year-old, if it is. John is gazing off into the distance, anticipating the future, presumably. Although how critics or guidebook writers know that is beyond me. As I swing to the left from Donatello's St. John's large hand over to Nani di Banco sculpture, it does appear that here these are smaller hands, and perhaps, were I more perspicacious, they would be normal hands. Look at the detail in the foot here. And yet, installed high on the face of a church, who would ever see this foot? This tympanum with inlaid stone, probably brilliantly painted.